Hi, fantasy readers. This is Corinne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. If you enjoy serial fiction, or if you've been wanting to test it out, you'll want to stick around for today's story. If you're not familiar with serial fiction, it's a bit like TV episodes, where you get snippets of a story in each episode, and they're all part of a much bigger story. Some episodes are strongly connected, while others function as standalones. I've mostly seen this type of fiction on Kindle Vella and Royal Road, and while both have fantastic stories, I've found a lot of them to be filled with content that doesn't fit the ratings I've set up for the podcast, which makes them difficult to recommend or share. However, today's episode features the first two short stories included in Daniel McCormack's serialized fiction Tales of Teltra, which is hosted on his Patreon site. He's committed to keeping the content both high quality and family friendly. Daniel was shaped from a young age by the gentle woodlands, lonely moors, and windswept coast of the Cornish landscape. He has an abiding love of all things Middle-earth, Earthsea, and the Wheel of Time. He lives in Cornwall with his wife and children, and tries to split his time between his writing desk and exploring nature with his family. Today's narrator is Paeter Frandsen, host of Christian Geek Central. Stick around to the end, or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from both the author and the narrator. For now, please enjoy Into the Woods and From Shadow to Shade by DH McCormack.
Part 1. Into the Woods. The ancient oaks of the old wood hung over the path ahead, dipping their bare branches low to the ground. They bent and swayed, blown about by the fierce easterly wind. Farin watched transfixed from the back of his horse. The whole wood loomed large as he approached, a living mass of rippling, dancing, creaking. "No need to worry, lad." Balin did not look up at Farin as he rode beside him, his eyes ever fixed to the ground. They were swiftly darting this way and that, silently noting the passing of game by the signs they left in the wet mud, in the bent grass and broken branches. "Not worried, just cold," Farin replied quietly. Balin snorted. "Just do as you're told. Stick close to Lord Rain, and you'll come home in one piece." Farin looked ahead. Lord Rain rode beside his blade master, Jotir, the two men talking casually while they ate in the saddle, gesturing every now and then towards the forest before them. The relentless wind blew their dark green cloaks flat against their heavy-set frames and carried their speech far from Farin. "How many times has Lord Rain been into the old wood?" Farin asked. "Hard to say," Balin replied with a shrug. "Been leading the hunts since I were a boy. Led me on my first two." Balin looked up at the two figures riding ahead of them, an awed expression briefly crossing his face. "They say half the wealth of Eowyn has come from his hunts, or from those of the men he's taught." Balin looked over at Farin, then tucked his black hair behind his ear. "This I can tell you for sure," he continued, returning to studying the track ahead. "No other man I would choose to lead me into these woods." As they drew closer and closer, the whine of the wind was slowly swallowed up in a great, continuous roar, the sound of the wind amongst the branches of the endless forest ahead. Lord Rain and Jotir paused at the tree line and turned, waiting for Balin and Farin to join them. Farin had grown up watching those two men from his father's fields as they had led companies of the hunt out past the family farm and into the wild, green cloaks flapping, brass buckles catching in the morning sun, swords strapped to their sides. When they returned by evening, battered but often buoyed by the joy of a good haul, Farin's father would offer them food and rest, and so it was that Farin spent many nights peering down through the stairway banisters long after he should have been in bed, watching great lords and mighty warriors sitting around a farmer's table, laughing and drinking with his father as they told the tales of their latest heroics. Each night, Farin had fallen asleep imagining himself as a part of their stories, slaying his own great beasts and returning home with his own bounty. Each morning, however, he would rise early to feed the chickens, tend the horses, and work the fields till dusk. Then, a year passed. Lord Rain had arrived at the farm long after dark. 4 of his men had rushed him in through the kitchen door. He had been covered in blood and was deathly pale. Farin's mother had not hesitated. Within moments, she had put all the men to work. Rain's men cleared the table and laid their lord gently on it, while Farin's father went to fetch her healing supplies, and Farin was sent to the stables to tend Lord Rain's horse. He had found the poor beast wild-eyed, shivering and limping with a large gash down its left flank. It had taken him the whole night to clean the wound and suture it. He had to stop often to calm the horse and speak gently to it, then return to his work by candlelight. Jotir had found Farin the next morning, sleeping against the side of the horse with bloody rags and a needle in his hands. Lord Rain and the horse both lived. He had thanked Farin's whole family with his usual somber dignity put aside, smiling broadly as he clasped each one of them by the forearm in turn and bowed low. Out of gratitude, he gifted Farin's father 2 new workhorses, his mother a large vial of seraph tincture, which was worth more than the farm would produce in a year, and to Farin he gave a dark green woolen cloak, which fastened about the neck by a brass clasp shaped like twisting, interlocking vines, the uniform of the company of the hunt. He had not believed it then. He still struggled even now as he rode up to join Lord Rain and Jotir at the edge of the wood. He was to be one of them. Farin's green cloak hung a little loose about his shoulders, and he was uncomfortable in the saddle. He was more used to grooming a lord's horse than riding it. Despite all that, nervous excitement jostled within him, infused his bones. Lord Rain looked Farin up and down, his cold blue eyes steely and calculating, weighing. Shortly he scratched at the gray stubble on his chin and asked, "How many years do you have, boy?" 14, Lord Rain, Farin replied. "That makes you a man, yes?" Farin paused for a moment, unsure how to answer, then gave a small nod. We shall see. Well, every free man of the South needs his own sword. Jotir?" The blade master opened his saddlebag and pulled out a long, narrow, cloth-bound package about the length of a man's forearm and handed it to Farin. Farin looked at it, stunned, then opened it eagerly. The cloth fell away to reveal a well-polished wooden hilt and leather scabbard, and within a shining steel blade. It glinted as Farin half unsheathed it. "My lord, Farin could not find the words. No one in Farin's family had ever been given something so fine. "A man does not forget his debts," Lord Rain replied simply, then turned to Jotir. "Make sure he doesn't stick himself with it, and teach him the woods as we go." Jotir nodded, then grinned as he grasped Farin's shoulder. "Just remember which end is the sharp one and keep it well oiled," he said with a wink, then added, more seriously, "and keep your eyes and ears open." Lord Rain turned his horse to face the tree line once more. "Daylight is wasting, and we want to be homeward long before nightfall. Balin, lead on." "Right you are, my lord," Balin replied with a bow of his head, and rode into the old wood. The roaring of the wind lessened as they passed under the boughs of the trees, the air now close about them. A lightly trod trail, used by countless generations of hunters and foragers who had come and gone before them, disappeared deeper into the forest, snaking between the gnarled oaks, silver birch trees, and through the dense undergrowth. It had rained the night before, and now and then the sun broke through the cloud cover above, shining down through the naked branches and briefly catching the carpet of ferns and brambles and dry brown leaves, causing them to glisten silver in the low autumn light. Farin fidgeted with his reins as he rode next to Jotir, trying to soak everything in. "Again, Farin, what is the old wood?" Jotir asked. Farin replied immediately, repeating by rote what he had been taught. "It is the wealth of the Southlands, where we get our dyes, our furs, our medicines, like the seraph nut which—" "Good," Jotir interrupted with a wave of his hand. Clear you listened to your parents. What else? It is also the sorrow of the Southlands, Farin replied, uneasy as his gaze passed over the dense undergrowth on either side of them. Many of our men have died here, to great boars, bears, the waterhounds, even to some creatures we have no names for. Correct again. Look at me, Farin. Farin snapped his gaze away from the thickets and trees and obediently focused on Jotir's weathered face. This is your first new lesson. You must hold both of these truths tightly, in balance. Don't let one drown out the other. Know why we are here, know what we face, and you will return home with more wealth than sorrow. He suddenly felt acutely aware of the sword now buckled at his side, the strange newness of its weight and presence there. He wondered if he would have to use it. He prayed silently to Elru Windfather that if the moment came, he would not fail. The old wood changed the deeper they went. The broad forest floor began to descend sharply, and they followed the path as it snaked back and forth down towards the sound of rushing water and the chirping of birdsong. The wind, which blew uninhibited all across the eastern sea and the Southland flats, grew even less here, the slopes behind them breaking its power and offering a rare reprieve. The air grew warmer the lower they went, and they soon removed their thick woolen cloaks, strapping them to the side of their saddlebags. Eventually, the ground leveled out once more, and Balin drew them to a halt, some 100 paces from the river which was now visible through the trees. There they dismounted. Farin watched the men carefully. They never took their eyes off their surroundings. Not Balin as he strung his bow, nor Jotir as he tightened the straps on his leather armor. Lord Rain stood on a rock and scanned the woods around them, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword and the other holding some rough Hessian sacks. Hand on sword, Farin, Jotir said, nodding towards Lord Rain as he tied their horses to a nearby branch. Down in these valleys, always keep one hand on your sword. Farin obeyed, copying Jotir's ready posture, left hand on the pommel of his sword hilt and right arm free to balance as they made their way over the moss-coated roots and granite boulders down towards the river's edge. They hopped over small streams which trickled between the rocks, pooling behind miniature dams of broken branches and fallen leaves before flowing over them and down to join the deep, broad river. On the banks of the river the ground was clear and flat once more, the soft earth dark under their feet. They paused, and Lord Rain drew them together. Farin peered into the brown river water, trying not to think of what could lie in the shadows beneath the surface. All looks clear, my lord, Balin said, still glancing about as he spoke in hushed tones. Lord Rain grunted in reply. Very good. Still, you never know. The grove is maybe 200 feet downriver. Balin, Jotir, we will stand guard. Farin. Lord Rain thrust the sacks into Farin's hands. You will gather what we came for. Keep your ears open and run to us if you hear any of us shout. Farin nodded and took the sacks gratefully. With that, they set off southwards along the river bank, following the flow of the river in single file, Balin out front with bow at the ready, Lord Rain, Farin, and then Jotir following behind. The river narrowed and quickened, now rushing over ridges in the riverbed, which grew larger the further south they traveled, until all at once the ground fell away and the waters disappeared over the edge of a small cliff and down into the forest below. Here, beside the river and close to the cliff, was a grove of trees with long drooping branches and leaves the green-gold color of early spring. They stood stark against the bare forest about them, a strange beacon of life and new growth. Farin stared in wonder. They were seraph trees, quick-hearts, as the other common folk called them. He had seen their sap used to clean and heal wounds rank with gangrene, and their nuts ground and soaked to make deep red dyes, but he had never seen the trees themselves. They were even more beautiful than he had imagined, their branches swaying in bright curtains of fluttering leaves. You're up, lad, Jotir said, and patted his back. Remember, eyes and ears open. Get as much as you can. Farin gathered his courage, then set off, hunched low and moving quickly. The men followed behind, then fanned out as they reached the trees, turning to face out into the woods while Farin passed through the hanging branches into the shade of the seraph grove. The light was gentle and warm beneath the seraph trees, and Farin was completely enveloped in green, both above and all about him. The floor was a carpet of brown husks, split open and sticky with sap, most still containing their blood-red seraph nut. Farin eagerly got to work, collecting both husk and nut as quickly as he could. The rough husks were difficult, sticking to his fingers and the sides of the bag, but after a few minutes he had managed to fill the first sack and was working on the second. In the space of 5 minutes or so, he would gather enough to pay for his parents' farm 3 times over. His heart raced as he thought of bringing his share home, imagining his mother's joy, his father's pride. Every so often he would stop, listening, looking about. "Remember why we are here. Remember what we face," he repeated to himself under his breath, over and over as he worked. He had nearly filled the second bag when he heard a faint splash over the sounds of the river. He looked up, his whole body suddenly tense. The branches swayed lazily about him, the light playing across the forest floor. He strained his ears, listening. There was nothing but the murmur of the river, the wind in the leaves. All at once there was a thud and a scream, then silence once more, followed by a guttural, stuttering shriek which split the air. "Farin!" Lord Rain bellowed from somewhere beyond the seraph trees. Farin sprinted forwards, burst through the branches, and skidded to a halt, looking about wildly. Jotir was on the floor 10 paces to his left, a writhing brown mass twice his size on top of him. There was a quick thud of footsteps. Lord Rain sped past Farin and slammed into the side of the beast, sending it sprawling. As quickly as it fell, it twisted to its feet and rounded on the Lord. Its sleek brown coat rippled with muscular strength as it slowly bore down on him, approaching on all fours with its whiskers flattened against its muzzle, tufted ears against its rounded head, snarling and baring its fangs. "Balin! Waterhounds!" Rain roared, then charged the animal. An arrow whistled over Rain's shoulder and struck the waterhound, only just puncturing its thick hide. The arrow hung loosely out of its flank as the beast shrieked again, then sped past Rain with the grace and speed of flowing water. Farin turned just in time to see Balin loose a second arrow. This time it found its mark, driving straight through the charging animal's right eye, bringing it to the ground thrashing and whining. A second later, Rain was on top of it, driving his short sword up and through the underside of its head. There was a grim, gurgling sound as the beast bled out onto the forest floor, thrashed once more, then was still. "The female! Where is the female?" Balin panted, a third arrow already knocked to his bow. Jotir groaned and tried to sit up, then fell back to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Lord Rain ran to his side and dropped to his knees, leaning over him and gently inspecting the wound. After a moment, he let out a deep sigh. "He will live," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. "We need to get him out of these woods now, but he will live." Rain wrapped Jotir's good arm about his own shoulders and helped the man to his feet. "Farin, get the bags. We're going now," Balin said, still turning his head this way and that, peering into the trees. Farin simply stood, rooted to the spot. "Farin!" Balin shouted and gave him a shove. "The bags!" This time Farin heard. He rushed back through the leaf curtain and snatched up both bags from where he had left them, near the base of the largest seraph tree. Something struck him hard from the side and fell on top of him as he hit the ground. Searing pain shot through his left arm. He kicked and scrambled wildly, trying to get away, to get up and run. Another arrow whistled through the air, and the waterhound shrieked, then leapt away. Farin rolled onto his back and propped himself up with his right arm. He couldn't get his sword from its scabbard. His hand wasn't working. The waterhound ignored Lord Rain and Balin, who had now both entered the seraph glade. Farin cradled his injured arm in his lap and tried to shift himself backwards. The waterhound snarled as it approached slowly. Each movement racked his body with more pain, causing hot tears to spill down his cheeks as he kicked and shuffled himself away from the beast. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from beneath his right hand, and he tipped backwards. His feet spun over his head as he fell. There was another shout and a shriek, the rush of air against his face, and something struck his head. Farin woke deep in a bank of rotting leaves, staring up through a tangle of brambles at the darkening sky above. He tried to move. Overwhelming pain erupted from his left arm. What had happened? Where were the others? Farin closed his eyes tight, trying to clear his head. Everything felt clouded, distant. Everything except the pain. He managed to roll onto his good side and look down to inspect his injured arm. The blood was warm and slick and had soaked through his shirt. He tenderly lifted his tattered sleeve to inspect the damage. It was just above his elbow, a gouge taken out of the flesh. His forearm was clearly broken. It was swollen, an angry purple, radiating searing pain whenever he tried to bend his wrist or move his elbow. Farin sat up slowly, taking steady, deliberate breaths and waiting for his head to stop swimming. He felt like he was going to be sick. He slowly untangled himself from the bramble patch he was in and shuffled over to rest against a nearby tree, then looked around. Twisting trunks and boughs and roots of ancient trees climbed over moss-clad boulders, disappearing into a thick fog in all directions, save behind him, where a sheer rock face rose to a ridge some 20 feet above. The events up on the ridge flooded back to him. He hoped the others were out there, somewhere nearby, looking for him. He heard nothing but the rustle of leaves and the pounding of the nearby waterfall. Farin tore some material from his undershirt with his teeth, then used it to pack the wound and bind it. As the flow of blood stemmed to a trickle, the thought slowly began to dawn on him with a terrible and growing force. He was going to die here. The daylight, diffused and pale, was fading quickly, and Farin could see no way back up the cliff face. He tried to control his breathing as panic started to take hold. No one was coming. He was all alone. Night fell, and the old wood came alive with new and strange sounds. Bird calls he had never heard before, a mournful howl echoing through the trees, and somewhere deep in the forest something massive passed by, cracking branches and shaking the earth as it went. Farin tried to stay as still and as silent as possible. Even his own breathing seemed too loud. The moon rose full and silhouetted the trees and rocks about him in silver. Farin drew his sword and rested it across his knees as he stared out into the darkness. Every tiny movement, every sound caused his throat to catch, his sword hand to tense. Branches like fingers clawing at the night sky clacked together in a faint wind high above him. There was a rustling noise, then something moved in the moonlight, just 10 paces ahead. Farin lifted his blade, eyes wide with fear as a small jack deer jumped out into the clearing before him. It started, then stared at him, its black eyes reflecting the moonlight. For a while they were both frozen, motionless, looking at one another. Farin felt foolish and lowered his blade. Instantly, the jack deer bounded off in amongst the trees and boulders. Farin felt a deep despair fall upon him as he watched the animal leave. Even the tiny deer seemed to have a better chance of surviving the night. It could move. Farin stared down at his broken arm, then looked up and out into the trees again, praying for morning to come quickly. The woods about him slowly faded into dream. He thought he heard music coming through the trees from somewhere far away, a strange melody that danced and swelled. It felt both foreign and familiar, like a song from beyond his childhood, barely remembered, awakening something deep within him. Part 2. From Shadow to Shade. Farin didn't know how long he had been asleep when something shook his shoulder gently. He opened his eyes. It was still night, and the moon was gone. Only the stars were visible high above, and shadows moving around him. Farin grasped at his sword. As quickly as he did, a strong hand grabbed his wrist. "No, Ruharan, we will not hurt you," came a man's voice, thick with an accent Farin did not recognize. "Your wound, it is not good. You need to come with us. Can you stand?" Farin shook his head slowly then, realizing how dark it was, stuttered, "My arm, I think it's broken." "Ah, yes, I see. Here, this will work," the man replied as he let go of Farin's wrist, then gently put a loop of cloth over Farin's head and tucked it about his injured arm. "Our camp is not far. We will go slow," he said as he helped Farin to his feet. Something licked his fingers, causing him to jump and look down. He could just make out the shape of a massive dog moving about his feet, panting heavily. "It was not easy to find you by starlight, even for us, but Beor has a good sense of smell," the man said as he helped Farin hobble slowly through the woods across the uneven ground. Farin hung onto the man's arm, too terrified to speak. His head was still swimming, his vision blurred, and a cold sweat trickled down his forehead. More than a few times he nearly fell, and the man had to catch Farin under his arms to stop him from keeling head first into the ground. Farin had no idea who this man was, or where he was taking him, but he did know one thing. There was nothing he could do but follow. After what felt like hours of slow progress, Farin noticed an orange glow through the trees ahead. As they drew closer, he smelt the wood smoke, heard the crackle of the fire. Slowly, his companion's face became visible. He was older than Farin, maybe the same age as Jotir, with deep lines across his olive skin and dark curly hair tied back in a short bun. "You are young," the man said, surprised as he looked over at Farin, then with a frown, "boys in the woods, waving their swords about, looking to grow rich." He seemed more sad than angry, but he snorted with exasperation as they reached the edge of the fire and he eased Farin down to the ground. "Juhan, look what they do now! Bring their sons to hunt for them!" A second man, presumably Juhan, sat on the other side of the campfire. He was younger than the first man and also had olive skin and dark hair. He was sharpening a small blade and replied without looking up. Farin could not understand. The language was strange to him. "You are not showing our guest respect," the older man replied flatly. "Fine, I will speak their tongue," Juhan retorted, looking up from his work. "It would have been better, Alith, if we had left him for the forest." "Dolal, Juhan. He is just a boy." There was a finality in Alith's tone, and Juhan waved his hand silently, then returned to honing the edge of his knife on the smooth stone in his hand. "Do not listen, Ru'aran. He forgets himself. We have been away from home too long." Alith crouched next to Farin, gently removing the bandage and blood-soaked packing from his wound. The surrounding skin was red and inflamed, and yellow pus oozed from the gouge. The wound burnt, and Farin bit his lip, trying not to cry. He felt like such a child. Alith rolled out a leather pack on the floor. Inside were perhaps a dozen small pockets, each containing a flask, a roll of cloth, or a metal instrument which reflected the firelight. Taking one of the flasks, Alith pulled the cork and poured its contents over Farin's wound. Relief instantly washed over Farin. The burning sensation was gone, the pain receding. Alith picked up one of the metal instruments next, a small metal stick with wooden handle and a silver ball at one end. He held it in the flames until the ball glowed red. "You will smell burning, but it will not hurt," Alith said calmly, as he returned to Farin and pressed the ball into the wound. Farin flinched, but felt nothing. He looked down. He could see smoke rising from his skin, smell his flesh cooking, but there was no more pain. Even in his broken forearm, he felt nothing more than a dull ache. After rebinding the wound, Alith fitted a splint and sling to Farin's arm, then sat next to the fire and passed Farin some dense brown bread. "You must eat, then sleep. In the morning we will take you back to your lands." Farin's eyes felt like stones and his body was exhausted, yet he looked about, peering into the dark beyond the firelight. "What about the waterhounds, or wolves, or something? Won't they find us while we sleep?" Alith cocked his head to the side as if listening. Shortly he looked back at Farin and smiled. "There is a pack of waterhounds, maybe 10 miles downriver. They will not harm us. As for the female that charged you off that cliff, well, that can wait until morning. You will see. Besides that, it is only birds and deer. You can lie here, Ru-Aran, next to Beor. He will keep you safe if you are worried." Farin did not understand how Alith could know any of what he just said. Beor nuzzled his hand and pressed his bulk up against Farin's leg. He was too tired to think. He didn't know what to say, how to feel, how to thank these strangers, anything. As he lay on the ground and Beor snuggled down beside him, all he could manage before sleep took him was a mumbled, "Alith, you saved me." Farin woke to the smell of roast game and the sound of birdsong. He was lying in the same position he had been in when he fell asleep the night before, flat on his back, with his injured arm resting across his chest and staring up at the now brightening sky. He must have slept like a corpse. He sat up carefully, trying not to jolt his arm, and looked about. The sun had not yet risen, but daybreak was quickly approaching, and small birds dipped and dived about them in the growing light. They were camped in a broad hollow, lined with trees, 2 sides of which were enclosed by a steep bank, and the third by the base of a massive fallen oak, a maze of dangling roots and earth torn from the ground. The 4th side was open, and in that direction, just through the canopy of the dense forest, Farin could make out the ridgeline from which he had fallen, the river tumbling over its edge, and the green gold of the seraph trees swaying in the breeze. Last night it had seemed like he and Alith had walked for hours, but in reality they had not traveled far at all. Beor breathed heavily next to Farin and nuzzled his shoulder as if in greeting, then went back to watching Juhan turn some plucked and skewered pigeons over the fire, salivating and shifting his paws impatiently. Juhan looked over at Farin as he sat up, but immediately returned his attention to the cooking food without a word. Farin struggled to his feet awkwardly, then scratched Beor behind his ear, working his fingers into his long, dark brown coat, and Beor wagged his tail appreciatively. Farin was staring out towards the seraph glade when Alith returned, carrying 2 full water skins. "Sleep looks to have done you much good, Ru-Aran," he said as he entered the hollow from behind the fallen oak. "This is a good sign. Very good." Alith held a water skin aloft, so Farin could drink from it one-handed. The water was cold and sweet, fresh from the river. When he had finished, Alith nodded, then turned and started to break down the camp and pack it away. Farin wiped his mouth with his sleeve, looking at his new companions while they worked. They seemed even stranger to him in the daylight. Their clothes were the first thing that struck him. They wore straight-cut, earthy yellow trousers and long-sleeved tops of a pale green, all of which was made from a material Farin had never seen before. It hung lightly, yet had the look of something tough and durable. Their skin was darker than Farin had ever seen. Their hair was a thick, glossy black, and the words of their strange language rolled into one another, indistinguishable, as they spoke back and forth. More questions bubbled up in his head than he knew how to ask, and he stood silently until he found the right words. "The name you keep calling me, Ru-Aran." The word felt strange in his mouth as he spoke. "What does it mean?" Alith looked up from packing away a bedroll, surprised. "It means man of the wind. It is the name for your people, no? Or so it was told to me. Maybe I pronounce it wrong? Suddenly Farin understood, and his cheeks flushed. Oh no, I think you are right. But only our lords and the sages speak Old Ruhari, though, he replied. It is only as Lord Rain has said to me before, Alith replied with a shrug. Perhaps I will ask him when I next see him. It was Farin's turn to be surprised. You know Lord Rain? Farin asked eagerly. We talk from time to time, when we meet in these woods, Alith replied, then paused and stood up. Is it Lord Rain who brought you into these woods? He asked. Farin nodded. Alith erupted furiously, his eyes flashing. What was he thinking? We will have strong words when I see him again. Strong words. Farin had no idea how to respond. He had never heard anyone speak about a lord in such a way, much less Lord Rain. He silently sat down next to Beor again, while Alith shoved strange-looking tools into a large pack with his brow furrowed. Shortly, the pigeons were fully cooked, and Alith took one and pulled the meat off its bones, which he then put on a plate and handed to Farin. I am sorry, he said as he sat beside Farin. I should not have spoken about your lord in such a way. I am just surprised. I always thought he was wise. Oh, but he is, Farin replied. He is the greatest hunter alive. He knows the old wood better than any. We were just unlucky, I think. Farin went quiet again, trying not to think of Jotir on the ground, of the water-hound bearing down on him. Does he know it? I wonder, Alith said, then looked down, pensive as he picked the meat from the pigeon on his own plate. Shortly, he turned and looked at Farin again. Your people come here to fight, and to take from the forest, so it fights back. We, Beor and I, share an oath to the forest. We come to care for it, so it cares for us. Do you understand? Farin shook his head, confused. How can the old wood look after someone? It's a forest. It's not alive. Not alive, no. Alith scratched his face and looked up, searching for the words. But not dead, either. It is something different. It is hard to explain in your language. Ah, do not expect the boy to learn, Juhan interjected as he doused the fire. It is not possible for them. They have their ways. We have ours. Juhan joined them, sitting to eat his own plate of pigeon meat. I am not so sure, Juhan, Alith replied. Perhaps he is not yet too old to understand. But it is easier to show than it is to tell, Alith said, then tossed the stripped bones from his plate into the smoldering fire. The sun was peeking above the tree canopy, casting the clearing about them in golden light as they broke camp. Juhan forged ahead, leading them back into the woods and heading towards the cliff face, while Alith kept pace beside Farin, helping him as he struggled through the forest. Farin marveled at how easily Juhan moved, skipping over rocks and roots alike, while Beor ran beside him. He had thought Jotir and Lord Rain had been sure-footed, but compared to these woodsmen they now seemed only stumbling babes. Shortly they reached the cliff face, then followed it west a short ways, until they met the waterfall. Smoothed stones jutted out from the cliff here and there, breaking the fall of the water, causing it to splash out in a mist and coat the surrounding rocks and ferns in a glistening wet sheen. At the base of the waterfall was a low overhang, which created a narrow way passing behind the falling water. Farin followed Juhan as he crouched and passed through to the other side. Beyond the river, the path ran next to the cliff face once more. They followed it until the cliff became a steep slope and then flat ground, where they left the path and turned back on themselves, walking uphill through the undergrowth. It was nearly noon by the time Farin could hear the river and the waterfall once more. Juhan was crouched among the ferns when Farin reached the crest of the hill. He waved Farin over and motioned for him to crouch too, then pointed down towards the river. Beor had already crossed to the other side and was sitting beside the seraph trees, waiting. Farin's stomach clenched tight as he saw a large brown shape emerge from behind the hanging branches. The waterhound slowly approached Beor, then stopped and sniffed the air. Its ears flattened against its head, and it turned to stare directly up at Farin, curling its lips back over its teeth. Instantly, Beor was on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The waterhound looked back to Beor, then to Farin again. Finally, it snorted and walked over and sat before Beor, bending its head low to the ground. Everything inside Farin told him to get up and run, to get as far away as he could. Alith rested a hand on Farin's shoulder.
Peace, Ru-Aran. You are safe. It will not attack. The creatures of this wood listen to Beor.
Farin watched, dumbfounded, as the waterhound lifted its head and twitched its ears, then lay peacefully on the ground at Beor's feet. He is like some kind of lord here, then? Farin asked, trying to make sense of what was in front of him. A large grin split across Alith's face.
It is a strange thing to say, but maybe yes. Look, it is safe for us to go down now.
Beor was looking up at them expectantly, tongue hanging out one side of his mouth and panting. The waterhound did not take its eyes off Farin as the three men descended the slope and crossed the river. Terror still swirled deep within Farin's stomach, and his hands began to shake as Alith led him closer. The waterhound sat up on its haunches as Farin came near, leaving its front paws to dangle in front as it continued to stare. Its eyes were glassy black, like two pebbles taken from the riverbed, and it twitched its white whiskers and cocked its head as Farin stood before it, frozen and staring up into its face. He could hear it breathing in and then out through its nose, feel its breath on his face as he thought of the teeth hidden within its closed jaws. Then, ever so slowly, the waterhound bowed its head. Beor licked Farin's hand and looked from Farin to the waterhound.
He wants you to touch its head, Alith said.
What? Farin spun to look at Alith. Shock was written across Alith's face.
I do not understand, but Beor says you must do this.
Beor licked Farin's hand again, then pressed himself up against Farin's leg. The waterhound had not moved and was waiting patiently, head still bowed. Farin hovered between action and inaction, abject fear mingled with a strange new longing, both swirling within him. Slowly Farin lifted his hand and reached forwards, palm flat and fingers stretched out. His hand hovered an inch away from the forehead of the massive beast, so close that he could feel the heat radiating from its body. Then the waterhound leaned forward and pressed its head against Farin's hand. For a time, they all stood there frozen, man and beast alike, and a deep peace fell over the wood. Even the birds fell silent, and the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, all of Farin's fear melted away. He felt the glossy smoothness of the waterhound's coat, the rise and fall of its breathing, and the forest about him was suddenly transformed. The dark shadows became shade to rest in, the looming trees a welcome cover over his head. All at once he felt like he was somewhere he belonged. There was a heavy thud of quick footsteps, fast approaching from along the riverbank. The waterhound growled, then dipped back onto all fours and disappeared into the seraph grove. Moments later, Lord Rain burst into the clearing from among the trees and skidded to a halt, staring wide-eyed at Farin and the woodsman. He rushed forward and took hold of Farin's face, looking him over.
"You're alive,"
he breathed, staring at Farin.
"I can scarce believe it."
His face was flushed pink, and large dark rings hung under his eyes. "Jotir is alive. He is with your mother back at the farm. Balin stayed with him, but I rode back here before first light in hope of finding you, and here you are, alive." Rain let out a sharp laugh and clapped Farin's shoulder, causing him to wince.
"Ah, sorry, lad,"
he said, looking down at the sling around Farin's arm.
"I see you have been well cared for."
Rain turned to face the woodsman.
Alith, I do not have the words to thank you, my friend. I owe you a great debt,
he said, and bowed solemnly. Alith looked at Lord Rain for a long while, his gaze cold and hard. Finally he spoke.
You should take this boy back home, Rain. You are lucky not to have his blood on your hands.
Lord Rain stared back, then looked down, unable to meet the woodsman's gaze.
Yes, yes. I just thought to,
he replied, then sighed.
You are right, Alith. It shall not happen again.
Rain turned to look at Farin once more.
We will have you home and in a soft bed before nightfall, boy. You have my word.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Into the Woods and From Shadow to Shade by DH McCormack, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you want to read more by Daniel, go to his Tales of Teltra Patreon site to find more of his stories. He releases a new story every month, and I've included the link in the show notes. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. And if you enjoyed this story and know someone else who might enjoy it, please send them our way. There are links in the show notes to make that as easy as possible for you. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.